Hello and welcome. Thanks for attending this Daoist Foundation remote talk. My name is Komjathy. My primary Daoist name is Jing, Cultivating Stillness. With Kate Townsend, I'm the founding co-director and senior teacher of the Daoist Foundation, a nonprofit Daoist religious and educational organization dedicated to fostering authentic Daoist study and practice and to preserving and transmitting traditional Daoist culture. In the Daoist tradition, we refer to these types of meetings and talks as Lundao. Lundao literally means discussing the Tao, with the Tao being the sacred and ultimate concern of Daoists. It is a Daoist conversation about the Tao, Daoist practice realization, and/or the Daoist tradition. It may be a formal discourse, something akin to a Zen Buddhist Dharma talk, or a communal discussion. It may be an abbot's lecture, formal spiritual direction, and even drinking tea together. This is because any meeting between Daoists always involves the Tao in some respect, remembering the sacred, maintaining sacred orientation. In our approach, Lundao usually includes both a formal talk and more open discussion. For these meetings, I want to talk about some foundational topics that may be of more general interest. So I'm going to share my screen with you. For this Lundao, I want to discuss the 9 practices, Jiu-Xing. These are the earliest known Daoist precepts, Daojie, perhaps best understood as Daoist principles, commitments, values, and qualities. So the characters here are Jiu-Xing, the 9 practices. Xing on the right literally means to act or go or walk. Originally, it depicted a crossroads. Then it was separated into a left and right portion, with the left side representing the left foot and the right side representing the right foot. So we can think about this as moving step by step, moving with awareness and presence. So this as indicating practice as some kind of embodied being in the world, enacted. This talk relates to De, inner power or virtue. I prefer to translate this character as inner power in general, as the way the Tao manifests through human being in the world, although some Taoist texts suggest that animals also have De. And then virtue in particular, so virtue in the sense of our entire character, including our conduct. The etymology of the character is the left side. The radical is chur, step. The upper right part is jur, direct, and the lower right part is xin, heart-mind. So an aligned heart-mind manifesting as embodied activity in the world. This character is also translated as integrity or potency, but I mentioned that I prefer inner power in general and virtue in specific contexts. It's somewhat familiar to people because of the title of the Lao Tzu, the Book of Venerable Masters, the honorific title of which is the Tao Te Ching, the scripture on the Tao and inner power. But interestingly, a lot of people talk about the Tao, but there's not a lot of discussion about De, the way that the Tao manifests through human beings, especially from a Taoist perspective, including this idea of virtue. So as I mentioned, De is the Tao manifesting as embodied human activity in the world, especially through beneficial and transformative influence. So we can think of this as numinous pervasion, being infused with the Tao and the way that energetic presence influences other beings in a positive way. From a Taoist perspective, this relates to our innate goodness. So we are innately good. This is part of the Taoist view that I discussed in the second Lundao on different Taoist kind of principles. It also relates to our original innate connection with the Tao, as well as wellness. So we are fundamentally well from a Taoist perspective. We can connect it further to Wu Wei, non-action. So when beings are free and supported, they flourish. So we can try to imagine and envision this, ideally enact it and embody it. This can be compared to modern distortions or mythologies about fallenness. So there is no fundamental problem, right? yes, there are problems in the world. Human beings create problems. But fundamentally, we are not a problem, right? Our lives are not problematic. So it's not about a story about fallenness. It's a story about possibility, of aliveness, of what we fundamentally are, which is good. This relates to alignment, attunement, and realization of the Tao manifesting as virtue. So virtue is a sign of cultivation, right? The more attuned we are with the Tao, the more we live in a virtuous way. It's beyond conventional morality, so it's not good and bad or good and evil, which are social constructs. It's not about social conditioning and control. It's about living through this connection, the way this connection manifests as beneficial and transformative influence. It's also viewed as a foundation of alchemical refinement and transformation. So Juji, establishing the foundations, often refers to cultivating virtue. This is connected to the models that I talked about in the second Lundao on view, and also in the first Lundao on the Daoist tradition. So we're talking about an ethical model. And one thing that's important here is, because it can be a source of confusion, that this relates to both a naturalistic and a cultivational understanding, or different kind of Daoist views. The naturalistic is what I was just talking about, that on a fundamental level, we are good, we are virtuous. So we're returning to that. We're finding a way to live through that. But it's also cultivated. So we actively, intentionally work to transform potentially negative aspects of ourselves and our experiences and our behavior patterns into their positive counterparts. So there is a manifestation through virtue. And one way to understand this is that it's almost like reverse engineering. So yes, we can do quietistic practice. We can return to our innate nature, which manifests as De, as inner power or virtue. But we can also actively, consciously cultivate certain qualities that are expressions of that innate nature that allow us to connect with it in another way. Another key point here, which relates to what I said about conventional morality as a social construct and a means of control, is that from a Taoist perspective, there's an energetics of virtue. So there are qi patterns or energetic imprints and resonant patterns. And this is a kind of important antidote to the modern world, because if we're paying attention, especially in modern American society, in the contemporary United States, it's like what we're seeing constantly is corruption and hypocrisy and kind of moral degeneration. And I don't mean that in a kind of rigid sense of superimposing our own values on the people. What I mean is watching people lie, watching people be dishonest, watching people do all kinds of basically criminal things, and there not being any consequences, and them knowing that, so them doing it in a kind of conscious way. And the Taoist response to this is that virtue is self-sustaining. The energetics of it leads to a kind of sacred support that's beyond a kind of concern for what's happening with other people or what's happening in the larger society. This allows us to be connected to the sacred, to the Tao on a deeper level. So here we have to connect it to Xing, innate nature, which is the middle character. Jing is left character, so stillness, and De is the right character. And in this kind of viewpoint, our innate nature is stillness. So when we do these kinds of practices, we return to our original inherent connection with the Tao and this deeper stillness as the ground of our being that then manifests as De. So De, inner power or virtue, is the natural expression of this connection. Innate nature also relates to the heart-mind with which we were born. So stillness allows us to kind of find this connection. It also relates to Pu, a character you may know or a term you may have heard of in Taoism. I prefer to translate it as unhewn simplicity, but it's oftentimes translated as the uncarved block. And this is about simply being, right? We can find what innate nature is in this kind of ground. And this further relates to things in Taoism like uselessness. So invoking like old gnarled trees. And what do old gnarled trees represent? They represent a kind of unfolding of our own possibility, our own purpose. that if we imagine ourselves as that, without being a tool or being made into a vessel for other people's purposes. So it's useless from a social perspective, especially in a mainstream way, but it's completely useful in terms of cultivation and spiritual realization. Neya, Inward Training, Chapter 22, tells us Nei Jing, Wai Jing. So in this case, the characters are written traditionally from right to left. So Nei Jing, Wai Jing, inwardly still and outwardly reverent. Just a brief note on the Neya, the Inward Training text. It's a chapter in the Received Guanzi, the Book of Master Guan. It's an important but relatively unknown, anonymous, probably mid-4th century BCE classical Taoist text. So it may be the oldest text of classical Taoism. I've translated as Handbook 1 in my Handbooks for Taoist Practice. And so the reason I'm putting this out here is just like the Tao and De relationship, is there's an inner and an outer dimension to innate nature, because this passage says, this is the way to innate nature. This is the expression of innate nature. So on the inside, everything settles down and we move into this stillness, this space inside of ourselves. But outwardly, it manifests as reverence. So this is one of the ways that we can recognize Taoist cultivation. And this relates to a kind of reverence for the Tao, but also a recognition of the world and other beings as a manifestation of the sacred. So we can kind of think about this more broadly as grace, as connection, as some kind of recognition of what's ultimately real. Moving into the 9 practices themselves, the Jiu Xing, I want to start with some background information, and then we'll move into a deeper exploration of the principles themselves. So you can just take a moment to kind of look at the 9 practices, these 9 kind of fundamental Taoist principles. As the name suggests, the 9 practices, the Jiu Xing, are the 9 Taoist principles and actual practices. As I mentioned, Xing literally means to act or to go or to walk. So more literally means something like the 9 activities. So they're like conduct guidelines or principles of embodiment in Taoism. They come from, so this list comes from the early Tianshi Celestial Masters tradition. They're the earliest known Taoist precepts. Interestingly, they're derived from the Tao Te Ching, the scripture on the Tao and inner power. So from my perspective, they're one of the most accurate, profound, and concise distillations of that text. It's clearly rooted in a close reading of the Tao Te Ching. So here we'll recall that the Tao Te Ching is an anonymous multivocal anthology consisting of various teachings and practices associated with elders of the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism. It contains material from the 4th to the 2nd century BCE. So it wasn't written by a single individual. It's mythologically associated with Lao Tzu, but more than likely Lao Tzu was legendary. So there's very little, if any, connection to the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching is multivocal. We can think of it almost like as collective Taoist wisdom, including specific teachings and practices. So here we should recall that the second part of the Tao Te Ching is conventionally referred to as the De Jing, the De inner power virtue section. So this scripture, this Taoist scripture, the Tao Te Ching, is on the sacred or reality, the Tao from a Taoist perspective, and its human expression, embodiment, and manifestation. These practices are rooted in Taoist contemplative practice and a Taoist contemplative approach, including formal apophatic and quietistic meditation, that is sitting in stillness. So this kind of practice is primarily contentless, non-conceptual, and non-dualistic. And if we kind of just look at this briefly, what we want to remember in terms of the history of the Taoist tradition and the context is that the principles themselves come from the Tao Te Ching. So the received Tao Te Ching. So we can just say, 4th to 2nd century BCE. So we can just kind of like cut that in half and say around the 3rd century BCE. So probably around 200 BCE. And then the early Celestial Masters. So around, let's say, 200 CE. So there's a 400-year difference. But what's interesting is that the list itself is from the early Celestial Masters. Okay, so we have around an early 3rd century or maybe later 3rd century CE text that draws upon a 3rd century BCE layer of the Tao Te Ching. Okay. Another interesting part is it shows a connection between classical Taoism and early Taoism or early organized Taoism, which are oftentimes assumed to be radically different. So both in terms of the engagement with the Tao Te Ching, the central importance of the Tao Te Ching, but then trying to embody some of these Taoist principles. So just, I'm going to pause for a minute and let you just look at them briefly. So in the Lao Tzu Shangarju, the commentary Thinking Through the Lao Tzu, which is the early name of the Tao Te Ching, this is a commentary, one of the earliest commentaries on the Tao Te Ching. It's attributed to Zhang Lu, so that's generally accepted authorial attribution. So he died in 216. He was the paternal grandson of Zhang Daoling, the founder of the Celestial Masters, so he was the third Celestial Master. This is a commentary that he supposedly wrote. And in this commentary, and so what you're looking at here is the larger characters, and the italicized is the Tao Te Ching, and then the smaller characters and underneath the italicized is his commentary. And so I'm translating the Tao Te Ching line through the commentary. So he says, the Tao Te Ching says, when you use serenity to move, your actions will gradually produce life. And Zhang Lu comments on this. Whenever human beings wish to undertake some action, they should first gauge it against the precepts of the Tao, Tao Jie. Consider this calmly to determine that your conduct does not contravene the Tao. Only then should you gradually pursue it, so that the way of life does not depart from you. So as I mentioned, the Lao Tzu Shangarju is one of the 7 early commentaries on the Tao Te Ching. This is fairly unknown to people. The primary commentary that people are aware of is the Wang Bi commentary that's connected to Xuan Xue, but there's actually 7 early commentaries. A kind of key detail for understanding this contextually is that the early Celestial Masters tend to identify health with morality and illness with immorality. That's not the whole story, but there is this sense of like having kind of moral hygiene, following a kind of path of virtue leads to overall wellness and protection from things like disease and illness. And this includes cosmological attunement. So there's this sense in the early Celestial Masters of trying to create a theocracy, kind of society oriented toward the Tao and informed by the Tao, including Taoist values and Taoist principles, but that this will also lead to a larger cosmological attunement. So one issue that comes up here is Zhang Lu's referring to these Taoist precepts or these precepts of the Tao, but he doesn't tell us what they are. Right? So he's advocating for something like precept study and application, but we don't have a list. And one possibility is that these Tao Jie here are the 9 practices. So I'll explain why I think that might be the case coming up. But there's a question of which precepts and how do they relate to these received precepts that we have that are also Celestial Masters precepts. So to begin, precepts or jie, the character that we saw in the previous slide has the yen, the language character or the speech radical. This one doesn't. This just has the primary part of the character. So jie. So jie consists of ge, spear, and gong, paired hands or joined hands. So one way of understanding this character is it's holding up a weapon as warning. So by extension, precepts are basically a kind of form of protection. They relate to this ability to ward and to guard. So from a Taoist perspective, precepts may serve as protection. We can also think of them as like moorings in a harbor. So in the midst of certain kinds of challenges in life or upheavals, they give us some kind of root or some kind of anchor that allows us to maintain stability. As I said, there's also an energetics of virtue. So sometimes when people hear about precepts in Taoism, they think, oh, these are rules or mandates that you have to follow. And there is a way to understand it that way. But another way to look at it, especially from a deeper Taoist perspective, is they're helping us cultivate this kind of energetics of virtue. They're attuning us with a kind of ethical way of being in the world. So historically speaking, the earliest Taoist precepts most likely date to around the early 3rd century CE. So that would be the 9 practices being dated through the Zhang Lu's commentary. And again, that's somewhat controversial and debatable, but we can just kind of think about that as helpful at the moment. They developed more strongly under Buddhist influence, especially from the 5th to the 6th century forward. They're especially important in organized Taoist communities and Taoist religious institutions, including monasticism. So, for example, you have the adoption and adaptation of the 5 precepts of Buddhism, the Wu Jie, don't kill, don't steal, etc., and then Taoist adaptations of that. We see this here is that in the Tianshi, the Celestial Masters, that's also referred to as Zhengyi Orthodox Unity, you have precepts, and there's the early Celestial Masters moving into kind of the next moment of development in that community is a hierarchically organized community with the Celestial Master, which is a patrilineal and patriarchal position at the top of the hierarchy, moving into kind of regional hierarchies with the libationers, the Jijio, also kind of thought of as parish priests, so eventually called Daoshi, being kind of the next level down or the highest level of the regional and local communities. And this includes a much larger lay community. So also this question of where does lay morality fit into this? And that would also connect with the precepts. There are also important references and emphases on precepts in Quanzhen, in complete perfection, and specifically the Longmen, the Dragon Gate lineage. So this is so much the case that sometimes the Longmen lineage is referred to as the kind of Taoist or Quanzhen Vinaya, the kind of monastic codes or the monastic path, the with specifically monastic rules. And this is because the charism, the spiritual characteristics of Longmen, is precept study and application, at least traditionally speaking. I mean, this is different in the modern world. But one way to think about Taoist precepts is they're focusing on Taoist commitments, expressions, guidelines, insights, principles, qualities, and values. And again, we can kind of compare this to rules. So they give us insights into a Taoist way of being, the way that Taoism becomes embodied in the world through this connection with the Tao. Here I'll just mention, if you're interested in Taoist precepts, Livia Cohen's published a book called Cosmos and Community that was published in 2004 that contains introductions and translations of a wide variety of Taoist precepts. So the 9 practices are found in this text called the Laojuan Jinglu, the scriptural statutes of Lord Lao. And this, as far as we can tell, is an anonymous 6th century Celestial Masters collection. So it includes 3 sets of precepts, and these are the precepts. So the Dao De Zun Jing Jie, the precepts of the Venerable Scripture on the Tao and Inner Power, that's the opening part of the text, and that's corresponds to the 9 practices. The Dao De Zun Jing Xiangar Jie, the precepts from the Xiangar commentary on the Venerable Scripture on the Tao and Inner Power, that's next. And then the Laojuan Shuo Yibai Bashir Jie, the 180 precepts revealed by Lord Lao. Just a kind of text critical note here, if you ever look at the text itself, the original Chinese, is the title of 1 and 2 are actually reversed, but it's quite clear that they're reversed. The first ones are derived from the Dao De Jing, the second ones are derived from the Xiangar commentary that I mentioned before. So the first ones are oftentimes referred to as the 9 practices, and the second one is the 27 Xiangar precepts. One of the reasons it's important to bring this up is that the text shows us that the first 2 are more kind of about general morality, so kind of Celestial Masters ethics or precepts for the community as a whole. And number 3 is specifically for the libationers, so these like kind of community priests. And we can also date the 180 precepts to around the 4th century. So it's earlier than the text by far, right? The text itself, the collection is 6th century. This set of precepts is 4th century. And since they're so specific and there are 180 of them, it's possible, and I would say even likely, that the 9 practices and the Xiangar precepts are earlier. And so possibly the 9 practices are the Dao Jie, the precepts of the Tao that Zhang Lu is referring to, okay? This text as a whole has been studied by Stephen Bokenkamp, Benjamin Penny, Barbara Hendryshka, and Christopher Schipper, as well as Livia Cohn. I've also translated the first 2 parts in as handbook number 5 in my handbooks for Taoist practice. Interestingly, a character or a figure that you might not know about, but his name is Liao Ming. His original name was Charles Bellier. He lived from 1947 to 2015. He established what was called Orthodox Taoism in America. So he's a complex figure, but he did an earlier adaptation of Stephen Bokenkamp's work that was being used in that Taoist community. So an American Taoist community using these, which would be important historically, especially thinking about something like tradition-based Western or American Taoism. The only other thing I want to mention besides the connection to the Tao Te Ching is you may or may not know Lao Zhuan, Lord Lao, is the deified Lao Tzu, the high god of early Taoism and also the personification of the Tao. So this text, and especially the 3rd section, right, the 3rd set, presents itself as being revealed by this god. So there's some kind of revelation involved and also a connection between Lao Tzu as kind of a pseudo-historical or legendary person and Taoist theism, or this kind of theology focusing on specific gods. So returning to the 9 practices. So we'll recall, right, they're coming out of the Tao Te Ching. They're kind of 9 key principles and practices related to the Tao Te Ching that then become put into the 9 practices of the early celestial masters, possibly early 3rd century CE, and that's what we're looking at here. So again, just take a moment to read through them. So I'll point out a few things. This is actually how the text is organized. It's organized, if you look at the left side, which is the section from the Daozang, they're organized as Shang, Zhong, and Xia. They're organized as upper, middle, and lower. So this could just mean 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, but they might be hierarchical. But they are divided into 3 sets of 3. So they're using a Taoist ternary, that is 3-based cosmology and numerology. They might be sequential, so it might be 1 is really the most important and 9 is the least important, so hierarchical. There's also just a way to read them that no, they're just talking about 3 sets of 3, so you cultivate them this way. There's also something interesting here, so a few things on a linguistic level in terms of grammar. All of them say Xing something, so here we're translating Xing as practice. Then all of them except for number 8 are 2-character phrases, right? Number 8 is a 3-character phrase. So the first one, Xing Wu Wei, right? And so on. So they all say Xing something, 2 characters. So practice non-action, practice softness and weakness, except for 8. So Xing Zhi Zhi Zu or Xing Zhi Zhi Zu, depending on how you want to read it. So I'm translating as practice knowing how to stop and be content, but you could also translate it as practice knowing how to stop with contentment. So there are different ways of kind of putting this together. But in any case, what we notice is that there's a kind of parallel construction, right? And this is important, 1, 4, and 7 all have wu something. So these are the ones that have non or lessness. So Xing Wu Wei, practice non-action. Number 4, Xing Wu Ming, practice namelessness. And practice 7, Xing Wu Yu, practice desirelessness. So one question here is, what's the relationship of the first in each of the 3 sets? Right? Are 2 and 3 a commentary and elaboration of 1? Or are these like kind of separate, distinct, but related kinds of principles and practices? So I think that's more of a contemplative inquiry that I'd suggest to you. But there is a way to read it where the second 2 precepts in each of the sets are more of like a commentary or an explanation of the first one, okay? So let's just talk about each one with a little bit of detail. Practice non-action. So Wu Wei is a kind of central Taoist principle, value, commitment, practice. Effortlessness, right? It's rooted in apophatic and quietistic meditation, so a kind of stillness and emptiness-based meditation. It's both informing that practice and informed by that practice, so much so that I think it's almost impossible to understand what Wu Wei is without a root in Taoist stillness-based practice. But in any case, it literally means without action. So we could talk about it as effortlessness. Sometimes it's talked about as non-intervention, non-interference. But from a Taoist perspective, it's really about doing nothing extra. So theologically speaking, we would say, stop doing everything that prevents you from being who you are, which is a method to return to innate nature. So this is quite complicated and really a different talk, but it's one of the central kind of Taoist values and practices that if we connect it to the larger text, it really is a method to return to Ziran, to suchness. Practice softness and weakness. So if we read this again in context, the Tao Te Ching connects softness and weakness with water. So the idea of kind of flowing, right? Being gentle, right? Responding with some kind of openness. And in this case, when we look at softness and weakness, I think we can also connect it to something like the soft tissues in the body. So what is the quality of this? And it's this kind of flexibility, this openness, this softness. Practice guarding the feminine. So there are a couple key points here about guarding the feminine. We've seen Shou before as a technical term for Taoist meditation. So when Taoists hear or see Shou, they know some kind of meditation is involved, some kind of contemplative practice. And Ci here is not women. It's feminine in the sense of yin. So the character actually contains the jue, the short-tailed bird, or the sparrow radical. And so this is talking about an animal. It's not talking about a human being. So guarding the feminine is guarding yin. It's being in a state of open receptivity, right? Allowing things to unfold, but also being able to connect with and perceive the Tao through this state of open receptivity. Practice being nameless, Xin Wu Ming. So Ming is quite interesting here. Ming is literally your personal given name. So your parents give you your Ming. So it's kind of like your familial and your social identity on the most basic level. But here it also relates to the Taoist emphasis on overcoming the limitations of names, of conceptions. So moving into a state of namelessness, which is also beyond social identity. So Ming can also mean fame and reputation. So we move beyond that. We're unconcerned about it. So practice being anonymous, practice being unknown, things like this. Practice clarity and stillness, Xing Qing Jing. So these two kind of key Taoist contemplative states, but also interrelated. So sometimes I translate this as clarity and stillness with hyphens, or clear stillness. And these are, I'll come to this in a moment, but this is a kind of key Taoist connected strand. But here what they're talking about is clarity and stillness as the rectification of the world. So going into this contemplative state where you still down, you enter the ground of your being, your innate nature, and then the spiritual clarity emerges, which includes discernment. Practice being adept. I'm going to talk about this more in detail in a moment. So it actually doesn't say just practice being adept. So shan can mean good or good at or skilled at, but it says ju shan. So it literally says the various aptitudes. So it's a plural. So something is being assumed here, or it's pointing to something else or something more than just what's being listed. And I'll show you what that is. Practice being desireless. So that's pretty straightforward. But here what I want to mention is that a lot of times when people hear desirelessness in Taoism, they think there's a Buddhist influence, but this is actually classical Taoism. So it's obviously different than Buddhism. There's a kind of sense in both traditions that desire is a problem. But in the Taoist case, it's because desire focuses on something in particular. It limits reality. It prevents us from basically being in this open state, and also like a state of contentment, which is going to connect to the next practice or precept. But it's not a source of suffering. We're not trying to like basically get out of the world, which oftentimes is the kind of conventional understanding in Buddhism. You know, desire leads to suffering. If you get rid of desire, you get rid of suffering. Taoism is like, no, we are not able to be fully present or connect with the Tao if we're in a state of desire. And this is obviously somewhat even more complicated when we read chapter 1 of the Tao Te Ching. Practice knowing how to stop and be content, or knowing how to stop with contentment. There are a number of things that are interesting here. Zhi, the second character in the 3-character phrase, to stop or to pause, is also used to translate the Buddhist, this is later, but to translate the Buddhist technical term of samatha or shamatha, that is calm abiding. So there's this kind of contemplative sense of zhi that means like a contemplative pause. So you get this a lot in Taoism. Like if you stop and you allow things to emerge, it's easier to know effortlessly how to respond to it. And this also relates to zu. Zu can mean enough or sufficient, or sometimes more technically as contentment. So one really interesting dimension of this is it's enough. You have enough. So obviously some people don't have enough, but we're talking about in a context of Taoist spiritual cultivation to use that view of enough. So do you have what's sufficient to do your practice? And more than likely, yes, especially if you look beyond just material circumstances or limitations. Practice yielding and withdrawing. So this also connects with number 2. So softness and weakness, yield and withdrawing. So there's a kind of question of what's the difference? One way of understanding yielding and withdrawing here is something about deference or circumspection or obscurity, right? So allowing things to happen, like basically stepping back, making space. So one way I like to think about Taoism and Taoists in particular is that we make space rather than taking space. If we connect it to number 2, if number 2 is more about the soft tissue, number 9 might be more about the sinews and tendons. So if we're thinking through an embodied perspective, a psychosomatic application, obviously it's all about the body. It's all about being in the world and being physically present in the world. So there's a way to kind of apply it to the body as like the way that we move, the kinds of beings we are in the world. If we read the 9 practices through the Tao Te Ching and the Tao Te Ching through the 9 practices, this is what happens. So this is obviously me going through the Tao Te Ching through the framework of the 9 practices. So you say, where do these characters appear? Where do these phrases appear? When are these values emphasized? How are they explained? So this doesn't necessarily mean all of the 2-character or 3-character phrases appear in all of these chapters. It means that these chapters tend to emphasize those particular qualities or those specific values or approaches. And what I've done here is tell you for the first chapter, the one that I think is most central for the particular practice or precept, and then the kind of complementary chapters. So this is obviously open to interpretation and exploration, and I would encourage you to do that. But one of the key things here when we look at this is, okay, we're studying the 9 practices. Then we take the 9 practices and we go into the Tao Te Ching and we use that as a kind of filter for interpreting and engaging the Tao Te Ching, and it takes us into these chapters. But then when we read these chapters, it clarifies deeper parts of the 9 practices. So that's bringing the Tao Te Ching to the 9 practices. So we can go in multiple directions. In a larger Taoist framework, this relates to scripture study. So a kind of key aspect of our own practice is jingshui, is scripture study using a kind of interpretive or hermeneutical lens. So the 9 practices are much more complex and deeper than they initially appear to be. They are that on their own, right? You can spend a lot of time reading and applying the 9 practices, but you can also couple it with engaging the Tao Te Ching, and then it really does unfold in multiple ways. So let's take a couple examples of this. The first example is precept or practice number 6, practice being adept. And I told you, this is actually Jushan. So various aptitudes or various adeptnesses. Just a brief comment on the chapter layout itself. So this is based upon a contemplative translation that I'm working on, a complete annotated translation that hopefully will be published soon. So this is my translation of the text, but also with a lineation pattern that might be unfamiliar to you. A lot of times it's just laid out as left margin justified. But here what I'm doing is pointing out that there are really at least 3 textual layers to the text. There are aphorisms, poetry, and oral sayings. Those are double indented. There's parallel prose, which isn't here. Parallel prose is just what it sounds like, but oftentimes rhymed, and that would be single indented. And then there's regular prose, which is left margin justified. So here what we're looking at is aphorisms, basically oral sayings, and then also a prose level or prose layer that might be seen almost like a commentary or a separate dimension of the chapter. So that's quite complicated, and a lot of this is discussed in this book that I'm working on. And anyway, in any case, the point here is that there are layers that we need to distinguish also in terms of maybe historical layers and formalistic features. So practice being adept, right? Practice number 6 or precept number 6. This is what chapter 8 that I say is like kind of the central chapter for this precept. The highest adeptness resembles water. Water is adept at benefiting the myriad beings because it does not contend with them. It resides in the places that people avoid, thus it is close to the Tao. In dwelling, be adept at groundedness. In centering, be adept at deepness. In giving, be adept at humaneness. In speaking, be adept at sincerity. In aligning, be adept at regulation. In doing, be adept in abilities. In moving, be adept at timeliness. Only one who does not contend is free from blame. So there are a lot of really interesting layers of this, but in our community, we refer to this as the 7 aptitudes, the Qi Shan. So Shan, as I mentioned, can mean good, good at, excel at, be skilled at, and so forth. So I tend to translate Shan technically as adept at, or aptitude, or adeptness. So the 7 aptitudes. So it's telling us, right? Each one has Shan in it. So if you look at the aphorisms, they say something Shan something. So Ju Shan Di, right? In dwelling, be adept at groundedness. Literally dwell, good at, earth, and so on. So we can read these literally, but I'm trying to show you on a contemplative level how I would translate them and how I would interpret them. So they're giving us certain kinds of activities that we engage in, and then they're giving us the quality to cultivate. And that quality then leads to a kind of deeper experience. So here, one thing I just want to point out, because you can obviously go back to this, is the second one, right? Xin Shan Yuan. So literally heart, good at, abyss. So abyss yuan can also mean deep. So that's not that problematic to say be adept at deepness or depth. But Xin here I'm translating in a parallel manner as another verb in the sense of centering, or you could even say it's the center. So I'm glossing it as zhong. And that's in keeping with classical Taoist texts that oftentimes refer to the heart mind as zhong, as the center. And so therefore Xin can mean center, or even here in a more kind of maybe liberal way as centering. But if you were trying to stay closer to the language itself, you might translate this as something like cultivating the heart mind, but then you're adding more language, right? So you're not getting the parallelism. In any case, it's showing us certain kinds of qualities to cultivate as a Taoist. So that precept number 6, when we use it to go into the Tao Te Ching, unfolds in this way, where now we have 7 more qualities or principles to follow, right? So one precept, one practice, and the 9 practices actually opens up into at least 7 more, okay? And again, from my perspective, this is a kind of contemplative inquiry, a contemplative practice. Number 7 says practice being desireless, so Wu Yu, right? So this is chapter 37. And so again, we primarily here have aphorisms or oral sayings, oral teachings in relationship to regular prose, right? So the Tao is constantly without action, wu wei, and yet it leaves nothing undone. If nobles and kings are able to guard it, so that's the show character again, shou zhi, the myriad beings will transform naturally. In transformation, desires may arise. I will subdue them through nameless, unhewn simplicity. So again, Wu Ming and then Pu. So we have Wu Ming now appearing with Pu, unhewn simplicity, with Wu Yu, desirelessness. So these are the kinds of key lines for our purposes. Through this nameless, unhewn simplicity, one will become desireless. Being desireless, one will become still. The whole world will become settled naturally. So again, using that contemplative lens, this is giving us a formula to approach the ground of our being, right? In a broader Taoist sense, innate nature, our original inherent connection with the Tao. So, okay, we want to return to nameless, unhewn simplicity. So we do this contemplative practice that involves stillness. And in that stillness, we become desireless. And that desirelessness manifests as deeper stillness. And this is really interesting because, like I said before, with the jur character becoming used to translate the Buddhist kind of technical practice of shamatha or samatha, calm abiding, now we have ding at the end of this. So we have jing and ding together. So stillness, and in this case, I'm translating ding, the last character in the last line, as subtle, can also mean stable. More technically, it means absorption. So if you get into this deep stillness state, right, tian sha, everything under the sky, under the heavens, naturally stabilizes, or you yourself become absorbed. So from a Taoist perspective, tian sha, literally under sky, can mean that. It can have a cosmological sense. It can also mean like the world as a kind of political or social situation. But from a Taoist perspective, tian is the heavens, but it's also the head. So tian sha means under the head, so the body. So the body is naturally settled. Everything settles, right? Everything becomes stable. We move into this absorption state. So being desireless here is contemplative. It immediately invokes this whole kind of complex framework of doing this kind of practice that will lead to a deeper state of stillness. I mentioned, I think clarity and stillness is a kind of key connective strand through the entire Taoist tradition. So one of the things I work on, especially in terms of research, is trying to show the ways in which there are connective strands in things that are otherwise talked about as absolutely kind of different in Taoism. So like the celestial masters and the inner cultivation lineages of classical Taoism, for example. So we're already looking at classical Taoism because of the Tao Te Ching. But as I mentioned, chapter 45 says, clarity and stillness are the rectification of the world. And here rectification translates zheng, so alignment. And we just saw world also refers to self and body. So do you want to align the self? Clarity and stillness allow that, right? Through clarity and stillness, one becomes connected, one becomes aligned. This moves into early organized Taoism, which we're seeing in this talk, which is the 9 practices and specifically number 5. And so there's a lot of connection between the early celestial masters or early organized Taoism and classical Taoism in ways that oftentimes aren't recognized when somebody uses this idea of 2 radically different types of Taoism. But this moves into later organized Taoism as well. So a lot of my own research is on this period. So the Qing Jing, the scripture on clarity and stillness, that's straightforward. The title itself is using Qing Jing in it, but also Qing Jing Pai, the clarity and stillness lineage, which is one of the 7 major lineages of Quanzhen of complete perfection Taoism. The history of these is somewhat complicated, but as far as we can tell, more than likely these appeared in the late imperial period, moving into the modern period. So definitely in modern Quanzhen, complete perfection Taoism, they talk about these different lineages. Obviously, Longmen, Dragon Gate, is the most prominent, the most influential. But Qing Jing Pai is interesting because it's honorifically associated with Sun Guar. Her Taoist name is Qing Jing, clear stillness. She lived from 1119 to 1182. So she was the only senior female member of the so-called Qijun, 7 perfected of Quanzhen of complete perfection Taoism. So this is technically a Kundao, a female Taoist lineage, but it is called Qing Jing Pai, clarity and stillness lineage. If we then look to the 9 practices and think about how they're applied in as through Taoist cultivation, this is obviously another contemplative inquiry that you can do. But this is some of the ways that we use them. So we use them as ethical practice, precept, study, and application. So that's pretty straightforward. That's just reading them, studying them, thinking about them, applying them, right? Trying to kind of think through how they help us, how they might lead to a beneficial or transformative influence or even resolution in a given situation. Scripture study, which we just saw, reading the Tao Te Ching through the 9 practices and vice versa. But also daily application. So Ruyong, sometimes I translate this more technically as daily practice, but here I'm saying there's the sense of applying it in our daily lives. And one way that we can use this is using it in terms of a 9-day practice. So taking each practice or each precept and applying it for an entire day. So today I'm going to practice Wu Wei. So then everything I'm doing, I'm thinking about Wu Wei and the application of it, or how a given situation might relate to that principle, that Taoist principle. And then also situational application, right? So that is, in a given situation, once we become more familiar with the 9 practices, we might say, okay, here, this principle would probably lead to the best result, and you apply it and you find, so this is like an experimentation where you find, oh, right, I'm becoming more familiar with them, I have a greater facility with them, and now when the situation presents itself, I naturally respond this way, and I can see some kind of beneficial result. It's also about embodying the Tao as an all-pervading existential approach. So these are a kind of distillation of fundamental Taoist values, but also like ways of being in the world. So we can think about this through what we refer to as the 3 expressions, the Sanxian. And I talked about this in the second Lundao on Taoist view. Cultivation, embodiment, transmission, with the understanding of cultivating the Tao, embodying the Tao, transmitting the Tao. So using the 9 practices, these 9 precepts, as a means to cultivation, but also as things that we embody in the world, and then ideally that become transmitted through us. We also have these kind of adaptation of them, okay? So this is our adaptation. You can think through them for yourself and see if this kind of resonates with you, if it fits into your own understanding. But the understanding the 9 practices in a simpler way as these 9 Taoist qualities and manifestations. So effortlessness, flexibility, receptivity, anonymity, serenity, aptitude, non-attachment, contentment, and deference. I'm the least satisfied with number 9. I mentioned this can also mean circumspection, maybe reservedness. So in general, what you find with Taoists who are cultivated and who are really committed Taoists is there's this kind of deferential engagement with the world, letting things be, allowing space for other people, imagining the possibility of flourishing and how do beings flourish on their own terms, and so kind of supporting that in these different ways. So we can think of this as qualities of realized Taoists. These are recognizable patterns and expressions. They also relate to observation and listening, so open receptivity and energetic connection. They allow us, they assist us, they facilitate this kind of Taoist being in the world. And this connects to view, practice, and experience. Okay, so these are what we refer to as the 3 orientations. We have a particular view, we have a particular practice, we have a particular experience, and these are interrelated. So we're obviously talking about a Taoist perspective on these things, a Taoist way of life. So we can take Qingjing as an example, clarity and stillness. Right? As a view, we understand that innate nature is clear and still. Clarity and stillness are the ground of our being. They're the expression of who we are. They're part of our connection, embodiment of the Tao. And so therefore we do certain kinds of practices like quiet sitting or quiet standing, empty sitting and empty standing as the practice that takes us back into our innate nature, which is clear and still. So we're doing clarity and stillness practices that involve some kind of cultivation and refinement that lead to an experience of deepening clarity and stillness. So one thing that I really appreciate about Taoism is it tends not to be strongly doctrinal or definitely not rigidly dogmatic. So it's primarily a practice and an experience that we say, okay, here's this emphasis on clarity and stillness. Here's a practice that helps you cultivate that. If you do that, you will find that your experience of those things deepens. They will unfold in other ways. So this also allows us to identify principles, insights beyond Taoism. So kind of being able to distill things that we read or things that we encounter as axioms or maxims. So this is from a poem called For the Children by Gary Snyder, where he says, stay together, learn the flowers, go light. So obviously these are rooted in a kind of place-specific ethos, maybe even mountaineering, right? How we travel together, what we should do, and so on. But it's like if we're following this Taoist contemplative path, doing this contemplative inquiry, we're attentive to when we find principles that might help us, that might guide us. And this involves listening, and spiritual discernment, right? So what kinds of principles are helping us? What kinds of principles are guiding us? How might that deepen our cultivation and refinement? So thank you for listening to this Taoist Lundao. In the Taoist tradition, we oftentimes say Dao Qi Chang Sun, may the Qi of the Tao be forever preserved, and then Cibei. So Cibei literally means compassion, but Taoists oftentimes say Cibei for thank you. So thank you for being here. Stay safe and well.